Chapter 41. Throughout the night, I kept hoping to hear the sound of the phone, and upon answering it, I would hear Freya's voice coming to me through the thousands of miles of telephone lines. "I have changed my mind. I am coming home." But the phone never rang. When I looked at the clock, I counted ahead 9 hours. 6 a.m. here would be 3 p.m. there. It was a ritual I had engaged in for 4 months, all the while trying to imagine what Freya would be doing. Agonizingly, I thought, "Lord, please bring her home." I pushed my foot out from under the blankets, but I wasn't ready to meet the day. I needed nothing to remind me that the day had arrived. October 12th, 1962, the date I had been dreading ever since Freya's letter, covered with foreign stamps, had arrived announcing her intentions of marrying her German sweetheart and making his country her home. And his faith, her faith. I pulled my foot back in and buried my face in the pillow. To accept the possibility that God would take away my only living daughter was against all that I had come to believe about the love of God. He had already taken my 2 baby daughters. But that had been years ago, when I had no thought of serving him. In the years following, I had come to believe that he had used that means to cause me to pause and consider the meaning of life. But now that my life was built around my faith, what could be accomplished by taking my only other daughter? Just the thought made me angry. I felt like Job. I wanted to curse God and roll over and die. But I heard Corey rustling around, so I pushed myself out and made my way to the kitchen. As usual, Corey had turned on his multi-band radio. He was listening intently, always on the alert for news about the weather beyond what he could ascertain just from sticking his nose out the window. As he so often told me, when you have scaffolds hanging on tall buildings, it is important to have all the information you can get. He looked at his barometer. "Looks like we're in for a storm. The tail end of Typhoon Frida reached 100 miles an hour near the Aleutian Islands yesterday." I wondered what kind of storm could compare with the fury I was experiencing. I attempted to focus on the oatmeal, but as soon as Corey left, I retreated back to bed. My thoughts returned to the days just after World War II, when my 2 sisters-in-law and I were awaiting our babies. We had moved from Seattle into the dilapidated house on Holgate Street. There was so much work to do, and I was so pregnant. On January 10th, 1946, we received word that Gurley had given birth to a healthy baby girl, Nina Elise. Svea's baby was due early in March, but on February 19th, like a storm swooping down to spoil everyone's picnic, the succession changed. I began having labor pains. Corey drove me to the hospital. It was soon confirmed that the prediction of twins had indeed been true. Within a few hours, the first was born, a girl. Then came more agonizing struggles. Finally, it's another girl. My heart was filled with joy. What more could I ask for than twins? From the first day I became a part of the Gustafsson family, I had declared that I wanted 4 children. That would eliminate the middle child syndrome of which I had been a victim. Too young to go with the oldest, too old to go with the youngest. And now I had 4. Corey pulled up a chair and took my hand. I could read on his face that he was glad it was over. I longed to hold my babies, but I was told that because they were so small, they needed to be in an incubator. I let myself sink into slumber. I awoke with a start. I felt I'd been on a long, long journey, like Periwinkle. Corey was standing at the foot of the bed. I looked into his face, expecting to see the same light that had been there before, but his eyes were clouded. Fear gripped my heart, a missing finger, a birthmark. Hundreds of things that could be wrong with a newborn. Finally, Corey muttered. The baby was small. I couldn't understand. A nurse standing by with a syringe in her hand consoled me. 1 baby at a time is all that most folks get. Suddenly I knew. I heard my own agonizing cry. The nurse swabbed my arm. The other baby is fine, but we have to keep her in the incubator. Can't I hold her? You just sleep. I lost track of night and day, but there were always reminders, the sounds and smells of other babies. And on one occasion, the glimpse of an official document with a terrible finality of words. Baby Gustafsson. Died in infancy. Corey came often. Each time he kissed me goodbye, I was torn between the desire to stay near the baby and to go home to be with Freya and Sig, who were staying with his mother and Svea. I longed to hold their strong little bodies. Freya, the little lady, and Sigurd, the bouncy clown, seeking applause for his silly antics and still not diaper-trained. Corey announced plans for a funeral. I was shocked. Somehow the need for a final act had never occurred to me. I wanted to go along, but I was too ill. I shrank down into the iron-like sheets away from the other two patients in the room, struggling between the desire to blot the scene from my mind and the urgent need to visualize it in every detail. The coffin would be small, of course. She had been such a tiny baby. Pink, perhaps. But maybe custom dictated white for an infant's coffin, to symbolize purity. Those who die young don't have a chance to get mixed up in matters of the mind and heart. It hadn't occurred to me to ask how they would dress her dear little baby. Perhaps her daddy would have taken the little Norwegian sweater I had knit and the booties to match. I tried to concentrate on the living baby. I longed to take her in my arms and trace my finger along the blonde fuzz on her tiny head, to examine her little fingers and her little toes, to hold her little cheek against my cheek. But that was forbidden. At last, my grieving was interrupted by the rattling of baby carts. "Dinner time," a nurse announced, carrying in a howling infant and placing it into its mother's waiting arms. The tender act brought me another desperate moment. Dinner time. It would be all over out there. Daddy and baby's grandmother would have returned to the land of the living. Life would go on as usual. Women would cook and clean house. Men would labor at their jobs. Children would play games and fret at lessons. Only for those who grieve would life be different. Upon my release from the hospital, I was told they would have to keep the baby there until she grew stronger. I was so downhearted. I had felt that at last I could get her out of the hands of the technicians that had kept her from me. Corey took me to Grandma Gustafsson's because it offered us instant care of Freya and Sig. Svea's husband was still in the service, so she was staying there too. When March came, so did her labor pains. She was in and out of the hospital several times. I felt pangs of guilt knowing that all our problems were adding to her fears. On March 3rd, Corey took her and Grandma to the hospital. It was sometime after midnight that the ringing of the phone pierced the stillness. Corey answered. We were awaiting the good news about Svea's baby, but it was bad news about our baby. It was the hospital. The baby has had a few convulsions, nothing serious. They'll call again in the morning. Nothing serious. A wretched loneliness surged through every part of my being. I spent the hours of the dark night trying to will away the dreadful fears. After dawn, the phone rang, and Corey sprang from the bed. When he walked back into the room, his eyes were vacant. He didn't need to say the words. He just sat beside me. My whole body ached. My breasts, prepared to nurture, throbbed. My arms, prepared to cradle a tiny body, could only cling desperately to a foam rubber pillow. All I'd been able to do for my babies was to knit a little sweater and 2 tiny booties. Another phone call came that day. Svea's son Tom was born on March 4th, 1946, alive and healthy. That afternoon, Corey packed up the children, and we went home. There was yet another funeral to attend. Corey and his mother sat in the front seat of our black 39 Chevrolet sedan. I sat alone in the back with my eyes turned up toward the dark clouds, trying to keep the tears from splashing out. I wondered about God. If there was a God, was he up there somewhere looking down? If I looked hard enough, could I see him? All my life I had wondered about God. From the time when, as a little child, I climbed in the madrona trees below our house and talked to the ants, or pumped up high in the big swing outside our basement door, wondering if I could punch a hole in the sky with my toes and see God. From the time that the whole family had attended a church service in Los Angeles and had heard the message about Jesus, and I had raised my hand to indicate I wanted God in my life. Corey was leading me up a hillside path. The rain was coming steadily, but then just for a moment, the sun shone over the landscape. I was shaken. Was this a sign from God? The service was short. In parting, a man in black directed his words toward me. Someday you will understand. All the way home, I was haunted by images of sod being replaced, elfin trickles bubbling along umber scars, roots reaching out, binding up the breach where 2 tiny bodies were buried. And the question, was this God's wrath? Mama had always reacted to my failing with, God will punish you. When we got home, Freya ran out, Mama, where are the babies? I took her in my arms and held her. How could I explain to her that the babies were dead? Her words were to become the cry of my heart for years to come.